The next movement is called Post-Impressionism. And what we're talking about here is after Impressionists, once artists got used to capturing light and getting color under control, they started to be rather bored with that, or it didn't lead itself to the expressive aspects of painting. So after Impressionism, we get a whole bunch of post-Impressionist, early 20th century art movements that explore different expressive qualities of painting. The first one I want to talk about is Expressionism itself as a movement. So here we have a movement where reality is shown as experienced by the artist. And there's an emphasis on this individual emotion or experience, a particular experience, or even their imagination. And it challenged this idea that the artist can objectively record, like a scientist, like a camera, the reality is out there. And the art forms are created to create a similar response in the viewer. Here in Expressionism, relies on color to communicate emotion. There are representational forms, but they're not very naturalistic, as here in Edward Munch's The Scream. There, we recognize a person, but again, we don't know if it's male or female. There's a huge use of distortion and simplification in these forms. The use of curvilineal forms lend themselves much more to feelings of emotion, like a woozy in and outness that we have in the water and the lakeshore and the sky here. So it creates some sort of movement and emotional movement within us. The space can be distorted for expressive purposes, like here in Munch, we've got this really long stretch walkway, perhaps a bridge over this body of water. And surfaces are usually very heavily textured, much more than the dabs of paint that the Impressionists used. They felt free to just gob layers of color and paint onto the canvas. Another example of an expressionist, this painting by Vincent van Gogh, and you can see many of the uses of color for more than just recording light. Yes, this is a night scene and skies are dark and stars shine brightly, but the emphasis is not so much on getting the exact color, but the effect that that sky created. So we have these swirling shapes within the sky, and even the ground, the hills here in the background, feel like they're moving because of the curvy organic shapes and the constant repetition of pattern. The cypress trees too, it's just like a living surface that moves in all sorts of directions. And even the more geometric shapes in here, this little village down in the valley below, even those shapes are simplified and slightly distorted. The roof lines aren't shaped, they're not hard edged. It's as if they're coming to life just like the sky is. So Van Gogh is expressing these feelings. He's laying the paint on very thickly and working quite quickly to create this feeling of the landscape and its effect on him. Kind of an opposite postmodern movement was Cubism. Cubism is a much more rational art movement that instead of trying to record reality as it is seen, they wanted to record reality as it is known. How do you know something truly? So what we tend to see is that they break up objects into multiple points of view. And so this is called the guitar player. And it's even hard to see him, but once you know the title, you can see the strings on the fret. You can see maybe the roundness of the guitar, the head of the man, perhaps an arm here or there. Picasso has taken all of those different planes and surfaces and isolated them and then kind of put them in relationship to each other. So objects are reduced and simplified. Light doesn't really exist to reveal form, but just to move your eye through the canvas. It's a light, glowing use of light to move my eye throughout this space and enlighten the canvas. So because they're messing with space, the canvases tend to look much flatter because there really is no form, there are just planes. And then also we have this very neutral kind of rejection of color in analytic cubism here. You only will see browns, blacks, grays, and when you go into the Art Institute, if it ever opens again, you'll see they have quite a number of cubist paintings, and I would not suggest that you go from Impressionism to Cubism because it'll be a shock to your system. There is a second kind of cubism called synthetic cubism, and it tends to work more with color and pattern, and also somewhat influenced by the Dadaists. We start to see bits of paper included into the surfaces. So still life here is a little bit more recognizable, like this actually looks like a glass, but it looks like a broken bowl, and the fruit aren't quite recognizable. There's a lot of distortion here. So Braque stays a little bit more faithful to the objects so that I can name them, and this still has form, but the space around them is totally flattened and has to do more with the pattern and movement around this still life. Another sub-movement of post-impressionism is called fauvism, and fauvism uses large areas of color for expressive purposes as well. So they're very interested in vibrant use of color for its own sake. The color isn't there to reveal an emotion, but the color is there to create a color harmony. So this is a person, it's a portrait. Matisse hasn't been able to totally let go of form, but he's really working with blocks of color to create this vision of a person. It's almost as if the person is just there to break up the color planes rather than to reveal anything about the character of the person. So what we have are highly saturated colors, flattened space, simplified shapes, and space and proportion are much more two-dimensional. They're not to show depth, but they're more to make us aware of the surface of the plane of the canvas. And the brushwork is obvious. It's not attempted to be hidden, but it's more used to create these different planes of color and then different patterns in the surface. Dada is our next subwork. And Dada came to life before World War I. At this time politically of Europe, this disappointment with industrialization, this disappointment with the happiness that it was supposed to bring, because coming up was the Great Depression, the rise of authoritarian states after World War I, which started in 1911, 5 years of war that was very destructive in Europe. So the Dadaists started thinking about how absurd these things were. They were challenging these ideas that there were people that knew better. There were institutions of power that we should trust in because they had been let down by them. So their idea was to challenge these expectations, assumptions about art, and about politics. All of these they wanted to shock people into re-examining. And here Marcel Duchamp is not so much a two-dimensional Dadaist. He would take found objects, and this is very typical of Dadaists. Two-dimensional artists were using newsprint pictures torn out of newspapers rather than generating their own drawings. They were also very interested in graphic design at this point. It was early on in the history of graphic design, so it's starting to affect the arts. Duchamp, though, worked with found objects, and the thing about a found object is it creates dissonance in you because you think this is a sculpture, but much more strongly you know the meaning of this as a bicycle wheel. So there's this dissonance to someone saying, well, this is an artwork, when you know darn well it's a piece of a bicycle. So it makes you start to examine your assumptions about what art can and should be. So a lot of what the Dadaists do, and this is picked up later by the Surrealists, is they juxtapose situations and objects that normally aren't together. They'll put them right together and cause this distress in the viewer. As far as I know, everything tends to be neutrally colored. Color is not an idea. It's much more something that is associated with the emotions, and they want to have this very critical examination of the culture. Now, Surrealism jumps directly out of Dadaism. The difference between them is that the Surrealists began to examine the inner person, the inner thoughts of a person, the personality of a person as revealed in their dreams. And the idea for the term surrealism is that they believe that that inner reality was more real than the outer reality that we all experience, because the idea was is that our psyche actually determines and shapes how we perceive reality. And we know that this is somewhat true. There's a scientific reality, but the way we receive it internally can be different for each of us. And this is an outcome of the rise of psychiatry and the work of Sigmund Freud. What's part of the surrealistic style is this hyper illusionary method. They went back and took the painting methods of the old traditional conventions and they applied it to situations that were unreal and unnatural. So part of what makes this disturbing is that you can actually believe that's a melting watch, and that form on the ground, we're not sure what it is, but those eyelashes look awfully real. On top of that, the surrealists tend to create these forms in a very cool, open, and alienating scene, so big and huge. Connections between the things. We don't know what the obvious connection is between this landscape, the tree, and the mechanical watches that are no longer able to function. The surfaces have to be really smooth. You'll notice you don't see any brush marks here or in this one by Magritte, because to show brush marks would be to be expressive and also to take you out of that alternate reality, to realize that that's really just a painting, not an actual reality that they're trying to create. Usually the colors are very cool, and you usually have these very strong, contrasting shadows. For example, on the barrel of this cannon here, you'll see that we go quickly from the highlight to a black shape here. There's very little shaded or muting of surfaces or gradations. Like even here on the nude, this is some really beautiful chiaroscuro or classical shading, but this dark, dark shadow is kind of like an exaggeration that makes this body somewhat skewed and uncomfortable.